last speaker is Mr. Brandon Hughes, principal founder of FAO Global. And I believe that he got a master's degree at Tsinghua University International Studies. You speak Chinese as well, right?
I do.
Yeah.
Although the more I'm here, the less good I am at it. Thank you everyone for taking the time. Thank you Eurasia Center for inviting me to speak today. One thing I want to walk people through is not so much the foundation of the relationship at a macro level, but from some experiences and highlights that I've seen by working at a business-to-business angle, which is also influenced by my role in geopolitics at the Carnegie Endowment in Beijing in 2010 and living in China post-Olympics. So to get started, and it's not that long, so don't worry. And I've included a lot of fancy photos, but I'd be happy to send this to you, so don't worry about what's on there. But just to introduce myself, my name is Brandon Hughes, for those who don't know me. I do have a master's degree from Tsinghua, one of the first U.S. graduates from their International Relations program. I'm also the first U.S. Army officer to have a degree from Tsinghua, so I claim that. Through my time, right now I started the FAO group a few years ago, essentially helping businesses understand the local and geopolitical influences that are impacting their businesses. So we work a lot of times with the business management directly, also helping them do market research and so forth. So we see a lot of things, we go to a lot of places. I'm traveling all over, and one of the things that we highlight is that we put a face to the industry and the person you're working with. So when we talk about mining operations or consumer goods or manufacturing, we don't talk about the industry as a whole. We bring people and individuals to that and help companies work through those at an individual and local level. So where are we at right now? Essentially, traveling back and forth to China once a month, we see trends emerging, especially over the last few years. When I was working at the Carnegie Endowment, we talked about mutually beneficial solutions. And now we see mutual distrust. And now it's turning into mutual suspicion. We see political rhetoric driving how businesses are making decisions and how they're operating. And then national security on both sides is being used to influence these decisions and operations. Most recently, U.S. is using CFIUS to look at TikTok, a social media app, which has an incredibly good organic reach if you're a marketer, but now it's under national security review. China has scrutinized import-exports a little bit more. If you go to any of the events from the AmCham Shanghai or AmCham Beijing, they're constantly talking about market access issues as primary concerns. And one thing that we see at the geopolitical level, how it's influencing business, is that companies and organizations are afraid to make a decision. They're afraid to put in investment because there's a lot of uncertainty around. And this is causing companies to become less competitive because they're not making the decisions that they need to be making. So, I don't know if you can see this, but one of the things we wanted to highlight is to talk about how, especially nowadays, companies are being targeted for their technology and use. However, when it comes across to the business person, it feels like governments are targeting their individual firm or their technology. And in many cases, they're correct. If you look at the technology itself, though, and this is across many industries as well, but if you look at the technology itself, you see these are U.S. and Chinese companies up here. On the far right is an artificial intelligence example from Intel, seen at the last Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. On the far left is a nearly equivalent system in China. Same technology, different uses that we've seen, but it does the exact same thing. In the middle, both countries are leading the way in autonomous driving. And so you see a lot of overlap. You see the same companies, the same inventors, the same types of business people creating these ideas, and we're using politics to drive how these are being used or targeted, rather than creating the policies based on shared values and then enforcing those policies. So it's just something I want to show, remember, it's always, the technology is a tool, it's not, and it's only how we choose to employ it. So we see, again, on the macro level, filtering down, that this is impacting just how we look at what is creative and what is being innovative. From the business community, again, we see leaders not wanting to expand on both sides. We recently had a group of 20 Chinese CEOs. They wanted to do a very comprehensive business mission to the US, and they held off. This was a few months ago. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of investment into this business trip, and they held off because they were afraid that they would be scrutinized or targeted just for coming to the US. Now, people who travel back and forth know it's not necessarily the case. However, the perception for those that don't travel often, and also on the US side, is that if I go to China, I'm going to be followed every day, I'm going to be watched, I'm not going to get in, I'm going to get arrested. On the Chinese side, they're worried that they're going to be followed, they're going to be arrested. Now, this is not across the board, but these are individual experiences that we've seen from business leaders. One thing we also notice in China is that when you talk US companies, especially multinationals have multiple headquarters. So the traditional idea of a US company is not as traditional as before, especially when you add in who stockholders are and where the money is actually coming from. Companies aren't leaving China. In fact, many are doubling down with an in China, for China policy. And our own anti-China policies, they're hurting US competitiveness because European and Japanese firms are jumping in. And so for at least the short term, these policies and all this uncertainty is only hurting US businesses. And we're not doing what is needed to be done essentially to create these structural reforms that you hear about in the news. I think we have to accept, we don't have to like, but you have to accept that things are done differently, and governments, as John was mentioning, are managed very differently. And so to expect sudden change overnight is very difficult. And without a comprehensive multilateral solution that will take many, many years, you're not looking at change anytime soon. So how do businesses work within this framework is one of the big questions that we always have to contend with. So for us, again, how can the business community improve the U.S.-China Trade Foundation? So one is we promote the positive impact of business engagement. We, whenever a decision is presented, we look at the pros and cons of a situation or an opportunity. Now, they're not all the same, and a lot of times they're not all different too. Being involved, we recommend businesses, especially in emerging markets, not just China, but emerging markets all over the world, to be actively involved with government affairs. If you're involved, you at least get to shape and influence the policies that are governing how you do business. If you choose not to discuss, then your opinion is not going to be heard. We try to get rid of bias. So, bias is inherent to every decision we make. We try to, lay down the facts of something before we make a recommendation or a action or recommendation. Apologize. One thing most recently, an example is that I've been going to Hong Kong a lot, and so I've personally witnessed many of the protests firsthand. However, once you start to talk to local Hong Kongers from different areas, mainland Chinese who live in Hong Kong, mainland Chinese who live in mainland, there is no one clear situation. And when businesses ask us, well, what about Hong Kong? What do we do? Should we do this? Should we not do this? we try to lay out the framework of what actions could be taken, what actions have been taken, and then what are the possible reactions. So we never discuss in absolutes because this stuff is changing and it's so nuanced. And and if you look at it, each person has an argument, and each argument makes sense to that specific person. So as business professionals and business diplomats, essentially, it's our job to lay out the facts and discuss both sides. Whether you agree with it or not, that's up to the individual. And the same thing goes for explaining how CFIUS works to a Chinese client, especially one that has companies that are very benign with no interest in national security. We would think that, again, social media, the example of TikTok comes up, but companies are concerned. We had a pet toy company concerned that their company could be targeted by CFIUS if they, purchase something. I mean, it may sound silly for those who live in DC, but when we go over to these countries, when we get out of Shanghai or Beijing and go to the smaller cities, people are really concerned, and that's because of the political rhetoric, this, what we see on the news, and the flow of information. And lastly, so how do we, from our small, the Army term is foxhole, but from our stance, how do we find mutually beneficial solutions? Can there be a net benefit? One thing you need to understand is, who are you talking to? Are you talking to a decision maker who's going to influence that policy that you're complaining about? Or are you talking to somebody who has nothing to do with it and just wants to make a better deal with you? You may have a disagreement with the government on how something's enacted, but again, what are you offering a realistic solution, or are you just complaining? And we say this only to reiterate the fact that these solutions aren't equal across the board, especially when it comes to businesses. Businesses understand that they have to work with both regimes, and again, sometimes, is it a cultural problem? Is it local? Is it personal? Is it political? Right now, policies and decisions are being driven by personalities. And so understanding that that's a person on the other side, or your counterpart, how do you work within that? How do you create a person-to-person framework through business that influences? And we used to talk about the term soft power. That used to be one of the great things about being an American over the world. We had a lot of soft power behind us. And I still think that is how we improve the U.S.-China relationships from business to business, but more so person-to-person level. And again, I will be here to answer any questions, or if you'd like a copy of our wonderful and beautiful brief, I'm more than happy to send it to you.